We found an old Ouija board in a Maine cabin. It already knew why we were there. In northern Maine, there are cabins meant to be forgotten. No roads, no neighbors, no cell signal. In 2018, 4 people entered one of them believing they were alone. They were wrong. What they found inside wasn't buried, hidden, or locked away. It was waiting, and it already knew why they had come. Subscribe now, because some true stories don't want to stay buried. In October of 2018, a remote hunting cabin near Moosehead Lake, Maine, was reopened after sitting untouched for nearly 2 decades. The property belonged to the Caldwell family, passed down through generations, but rarely used after the death of its last permanent occupant in the late 1990s. That occupant was Walter Caldwell, a reclusive man who had lived alone for years and died of unknown causes during a winter storm. His body was found months later when snow finally receded. The people who returned to the cabin were not strangers. They were family. Ethan Caldwell, 34, was Walter's grandson. He worked as a freelance videographer in Portland and had recently begun documenting abandoned locations across New England. He brought with him his older sister, Hannah Caldwell, a licensed social worker struggling with prolonged grief after the stillbirth of her first child earlier that year. Joining them were Mark Delaney, Ethan's longtime friend and audio technician, and Claire Whitmore, Hannah's close friend from college who specialized in environmental research. Their reason for going was practical on the surface. The family intended to sell the land. Ethan volunteered to assess the condition of the cabin and document any items of historical value. Hannah agreed to come reluctantly, believing closure might help her process the loss she had been unable to name aloud. The trip was planned for 3 days. No one expected anything more than decay and silence. The cabin stood deep in the woods, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that cut through miles of dense forest. The trees grew close together, blocking sunlight even at midday. The air felt damp and heavy, carrying the smell of moss and rotting leaves. The cabin itself was a single-story structure built of untreated pine logs, darkened with age and moisture. The roof sagged slightly, but the walls were intact. No vandalism, no signs of intrusion. When they unlocked the door, the smell hit them immediately. Not rot, not mold, something older. Stale air layered with a faint metallic tang, as if the cabin had been sealed too tightly for too long. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left. A half-empty bookshelf. A table with one chair pulled back. A bed neatly made. There were no personal photographs. Ethan began filming almost immediately, narrating quietly for his own reference. He noted how everything felt preserved, not abandoned. Hannah stayed near the doorway, visibly tense. Claire walked the perimeter, observing structural integrity. Mark checked audio levels, noting an odd static hiss that persisted despite equipment changes. The first strange detail was the calendar. It hung crooked on the kitchen wall, open to October 1997. Several dates were circled in red ink. One of them matched the day they arrived. The ink was faded, but unmistakable. Ethan dismissed it as coincidence. Hannah did not comment, but later admitted she felt a sudden tightening in her chest when she saw it. They settled in for the night as daylight faded quickly. The cabin had no electricity, relying on lanterns and a small generator outside. As darkness closed in, the forest seemed to press closer. Sounds carried strangely. Branches snapped without wind. Footsteps echoed too close to the walls. The Ouija board was discovered the next morning. It was in a storage trunk beneath the bed in the small bedroom Walter had used. The trunk was locked, but the lock was old and brittle, breaking easily. Inside were a few notebooks, yellowed newspapers, and at the bottom, wrapped in a cloth, the board. It was wooden, not cardboard. Hand-carved letters. The planchette smooth from use. No manufacturer markings. No instructions. Claire initially assumed it was a novelty or something Walter had acquired out of curiosity. Ethan found it visually compelling, remarking on its craftsmanship. Hannah froze when she saw it. She claimed she felt dizzy, as if the room had shifted. The board was placed on the kitchen table for filming purposes. No one intended to use it. That intention changed slowly, not through suggestion but through silence. The cabin felt increasingly oppressive as the day went on. The air grew colder inside despite mild temperatures outside. The generator failed repeatedly for no apparent reason. That night they noticed the notebooks. Walter Caldwell had kept detailed journals. Most entries were mundane: weather patterns, wildlife sightings, maintenance notes. Then the tone shifted. Pages filled with diagrams of the cabin's interior, measurements, hallways labeled incorrectly, notes about pressure points, mentions of alignment and entry. The handwriting deteriorated over time, becoming jagged and frantic. One entry stood out. It referenced the board knowing intent before contact. Hannah insisted they leave the next morning. Ethan argued they finish documenting first. Mark remained neutral but visibly unsettled. Claire suggested scientific curiosity, stating that isolation often produced paranoia. They compromised by staying one more night. The second night was worse. Mark's audio equipment began recording interference even when powered off. Low-frequency sounds registered on devices placed on flat surfaces. Ethan reviewed footage and noticed shadows shifting in frames where no movement should have occurred. Claire experienced sudden nosebleeds, dismissing them as dry air. Hannah had trouble sleeping, reporting vivid dreams of the cabin rearranging itself around her. The Ouija board was moved without explanation. They found it in the center of the living area the next morning. No one admitted to touching it. The cloth it had been wrapped in was folded neatly beside it. The planchette rested over the center, aligned precisely. Ethan suggested documenting it fully before disposal. Hannah objected, stating that the board felt aware. Claire attempted to rationalize the sensation as psychological projection. Mark did not speak. They began noticing the board responding before interaction. When someone approached it, the planchette shifted slightly, as if reacting to presence rather than touch. The movement was subtle but undeniable. The most disturbing realization came when Ethan compared the journal diagrams to the board. The layout matched. The cabin itself corresponded to the board's markings. Rooms aligned with letters. Entryways marked with symbols found carved faintly into the cabin's beams. Walter had not been contacting something through the board. He had been mapping something already there. By late afternoon, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birds, no wind. The cabin felt sealed. Hannah became convinced that their arrival had activated something unfinished. Ethan reluctantly agreed to pack up at dawn. That night, the planchette spelled out a message without hands guiding it. Not names. Not warnings. Intent. It spelled why they had come. And it was correct. The realization left them shaken, aware for the first time that the cabin had not been waiting for visitors. It had been waiting for them. By the time dawn arrived, none of them believed leaving would be simple. The realization that the Ouija board had spelled out their intent before any physical contact fractured the last layer of denial. The cabin no longer felt like a structure but a mechanism, something arranged with purpose. The forest beyond the windows looked unchanged, yet distant, as if depth itself had been altered overnight. Ethan attempted to restart the generator at first light. It failed completely. The fuel was full. The wiring intact. The pull cord snapped clean off in his hand. Mark's phone showed a full battery but refused to power on. Claire's GPS device displayed coordinates that placed them miles offshore, deep into Moosehead Lake, despite the cabin sitting inland. Hannah felt pressure behind her eyes so intense she vomited outside, describing the sensation as something pushing outward from her skull. Inside, the cabin had shifted. Furniture was no longer where it had been the night before. The kitchen table had rotated slightly, aligning with the hallway. Chairs were placed in corners facing inward. The journals Walter Caldwell had kept were stacked neatly beside the Ouija board, opened to the same page. That page contained a single sentence written repeatedly, the ink pressed so hard it tore through paper. It responds to need, not curiosity. The planchette began moving again, slowly, deliberately, without hands. It did not form words this time. It traced paths across the board, mirroring the cabin's layout. Each pause corresponded to a room. Each stop coincided with one of them standing nearby, as if the board were identifying occupants rather than asking questions. Hannah collapsed shortly after. Her breathing became shallow, erratic. She stared at the ceiling, tracking movement that wasn't visible. Claire attempted to administer first aid but found Hannah's pulse fluctuating wildly, spiking whenever the board shifted. Ethan filmed instinctively, then stopped when he noticed his reflection in the lens lagging behind his movements. Mark was the first to attempt leaving. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The forest beyond stretched unnaturally long, the trees bending inward, their trunks misaligned. After several steps, he turned back, disoriented, and found the cabin directly behind him. He had not walked more than 10 feet. Panic set in. He ran again. The result was the same. The cabin did not allow distance. Walter Caldwell's final journal entries explained why. He had not lived there alone. He had inherited the land knowing something beneath it demanded structure, order, and acknowledgement. The cabin had been built not as shelter but as containment. The board was never meant to summon. It was meant to focus, to give shape to something that existed without form. Walter wrote about maintaining balance, about replacing himself eventually. The last entry referenced bloodlines and unresolved grief acting as anchors. Hannah screamed when she read it. The board responded violently. The planchette spun, slamming against the edges until cracks spread through the wood. The temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed along the walls despite the season. Mark experienced intense ringing in his ears, followed by sudden silence so complete it felt suffocating. One by one, they began to fracture. Claire lost consciousness for several minutes. When she woke, she spoke calmly but incorrectly, describing events that had not happened yet. Ethan noticed she referred to the cabin as if it were a living system, using anatomical terms instead of architectural ones. Mark began seeing duplicates of himself in reflective surfaces, each version misaligned, moving independently. Hannah was taken last. Her grief became leverage. The pressure behind her eyes intensified until she could no longer see clearly. She clawed at the walls, insisting something was trying to fold her inward. The board spelled out a single word repeatedly. Not her name. Not death. Replacement. The cabin demanded continuity. Ethan understood then that survival was conditional. Walter had stayed until his body failed, maintaining alignment through isolation. The cabin now required another anchor. The board was not choosing randomly. It was identifying who could sustain the structure. The decision was not spoken. Mark attempted to destroy the board. He lifted it and smashed it against the stone hearth. The wood cracked but did not break. The planchette embedded itself into the floor, vibrating violently. A deep groaning sound reverberated through the cabin, not audible but felt in the chest and teeth. Claire began bleeding from the nose and ears simultaneously. The forest outside went completely dark. Time fractured after that. Ethan remembered flashes rather than sequence. Mark screaming without sound. Claire writing symbols identical to Walter's notes without realizing it. Hannah seated at the kitchen table, posture rigid, eyes vacant, breathing steady but wrong. The cabin rearranged itself repeatedly, hallways narrowing, rooms stretching. The board remained at the center, always accessible, always active. When morning came again, only 2 of them remained conscious. Claire was gone. No sign of struggle. No blood. Just absence. Her backpack sat by the door, neatly zipped. Mark was alive but unresponsive, sitting in the spare room Walter once used, hands resting on his knees, eyes tracking something slow and deliberate moving along the ceiling. Hannah did not recognize Ethan. She spoke rarely now, but when she did, it was to describe structural concerns. She insisted certain rooms were weakening. She referred to the forest as excess material. She no longer referenced her child, her life, or herself. Ethan made one final attempt to escape, dragging Mark with him. They reached the tree line before the pressure returned, bending space until the cabin loomed behind them again. Mark collapsed, his body seizing violently. Ethan dragged him back, realizing resistance only accelerated collapse. The choice became clear. The cabin required one caretaker. One mind aligned enough to maintain structure without dissolving entirely. Walter had managed it for years. Hannah could not. Mark was already fragmented. Claire was gone. Ethan documented everything he could, hiding the footage in the crawlspace beneath the cabin. He wrote instructions, warnings, maps. He placed the board back where it belonged, centered, aligned. By the time search teams arrived weeks later, only one person was found. Hannah Caldwell was discovered alone in the cabin, alive but unresponsive, seated at the kitchen table. The property showed no signs of the others. No footprints. No disturbance. The journals were missing. The crawlspace empty. The Ouija board was gone. Authorities ruled the others lost in the wilderness. Hannah was institutionalized indefinitely. She never spoke again, but nurses reported her rearranging furniture obsessively, aligning objects toward corners, whispering about load-bearing stress. She died quietly 3 years later. The land was sold. The cabin demolished. In 2022, hikers reported finding carved wooden letters embedded in trees near Moosehead Lake, spelling layouts that matched a structure no longer standing. Something there had lost its container, and it was waiting to be rebuilt. That cabin no longer exists, but the land does. And so do the records they tried to erase. If you want more true horror stories like this, stories that don't end when the video does, subscribe now.